Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to our reading of Pride and Prejudice. We are not just talking about this book, we're reading it together. How much fun is that? How little did I guess in any way 20, 30 years ago that this would even be possible to do. How incredible that is. That I'm reading this book to a whole bunch of people who are reading it with me. Some for the first time, some for the millionth time. Wonderful. Absolutely wonderful. We are up to chapter 50. Only 10 chapters left to go. And we are getting mail, we are getting much looked for letters from London, where Mr. Bennet and Mrs. Bennet and the Bennet girls are trying to figure out what's going on with their one of the Bennet sisters, Lydia, who has run off with none other than the infamous Mr. Wickham. And for a while there, it's not known what's going on. Are they running to Gretna Green to get married, even though they have no prospects of any kind, or is it worse? Are they not going to get married, just going to shack up together or whatnot, to the ultimate disgrace of their family? It's caused a whole bunch of a tumult back at Longbourn, but we are all at a distance from the action because Mr. Bennet, the head of the family, the unworthy head of the family, has been sent back from the city by Mr. Gardner, his brother-in-law, so that Mr. Gardner could take care of everything. And Mr. Bennet is just back at home. But he's being consulted. Mr. Gardner has found the couple, and they have struck terms with him, a bargain with him. How much money will it take to make this right, to make it respectable? There's a certain sum of money out there that is settled on the Bennet girls when their parents die. Is Mr. Bennet and are Mr. and Mrs. Bennet willing to settle that money on Lydia now? And are they willing to give her a certain amount of money a year? Give Wickham, in other words, a certain amount of money a year. If that happens, well, then they'll marry and they'll be respectable. They'll be married out of Mr. Gardner's house at Gracechurch Street. It'll all seem above board. And maybe the scandalous rumors of how it all started will die down, because Mrs. Bennet will have a married daughter. They'll start to have a family. They'll seem respectable on the surface. As Mr. Bennet tells us in the last chapter, he considers it a cheap bargain to get the whole thing settled by someone else at a distance without bothering him or getting him out of his library for so relatively small an amount. He worries for a while how much other money has been spent and how he's possibly going to repay Mr. Gardner, but he doesn't worry about it that much, as we're going to see, because this is the start of chapter 50. Mr. Bennet had very often wished, before this period of his life, that instead of spending his whole income, he had laid by an annual sum for the better provision of his children and of his wife if she survived him. Yeah, he has never laid money aside. So when a catastrophe comes, he is completely at the mercy of other people. He now wished it more than ever. Had he done his duty in that respect, Lydia need not have been indebted to her uncle for whatever an honor or credit could now be purchased for her. The satisfaction of prevailing on one of the most worthless young men in Great Britain to be her husband might have rested in its proper place. He was seriously concerned that a cause of so little advantage to anyone should be forwarded at the sole expense of his brother-in-law, and he was determined, if possible, to find out the extent of his assistance and to discharge the obligation as soon as he could. But fantastic sums have been bruited around. £10,000, £5,000. Mr. Bennet can't pay that back from the proceeds of Longbourn estate. When first Mr. Bennet had married, economy was held to be perfectly useless, for of course there were to have been a son. This son was to join in cutting off the entail as soon as he should be of age, and the widow and younger children would by that means be provided for. 5 daughters successively entered the world, and yet the son was to come, and Mrs. Bennet, for many years after Lydia's birth, had been certain that he would. This event had at last been despaired of, but it was then too late to be saving. Why? Guess you've got girls to provide for, but you're not even paying for tutors for them. Mrs. Bennet had no turn for economy, and her husband's love of independence had alone prevented their exceeding their income. It's kind of touching in a way, this little detail, that Mr. Bennet and even Mrs. Bennet waited and hoped all these years for a son. Of course, the son would inherit Longbourn, so we wouldn't have to worry about the entail. But it never happens, and you picture them waiting and hoping, even maybe long after the simple course of nature knew that it would not happen. Rather touching, in a way. Pretty much the only touching note that I'm going to have for Mr. Bennet in this chapter. £5,000 was settled by marriage articles on Mrs. Bennet and the children. but in what proportions it should be divided amongst the latter depended on the will of the parents. This was one point, with regards to Lydia at least, which was now to be settled, and Mr. Bennet could have no hesitation in acceding to the proposal before him. In terms of grateful acknowledgment for the kindness of his brother, though expressed most concisely, he then delivered on paper his perfect approbation of all that was done, and his willingness to fulfill the engagements that had been made for him. He had never before supposed that, could Wickham be prevailed on to marry his daughter, it would be done with so little inconvenience to himself, as by the present arrangement. He could scarcely be £10 a year the loser, by the hundred that was to be paid for them, and what with her board and pocket allowance, and the continual presents in money which passed to her, through her mother's hands, Lydia's expenses had been very little within that sum. In other words, in mercenary terms here, she's asking for £100 a year, and she cost him that anyway. And here, scandal is largely averted, and the whole thing is taken care of by somebody else. He doesn't need to leave his library. That it would be done with such trifling exertion on his side, too, was another very welcome surprise, for his chief wish at present was to have as little trouble in the business as possible. Again, I say, Mr. Bennet is a horrible father. When the first transports of rage, which had produced his activity in seeking her, were over, he naturally returned to all his former indolence. His letter was soon dispatched, for though dilatory in undertaking business, he was quick in its execution. He begged to know farther particulars of what he was indebted to his brother, but was too angry with Lydia to send any message to her. The good news quickly spread through the house, and with proportionate speed through the neighborhood. It was borne in the latter with decent philosophy. To be sure, it would have been more for the advantage of conversation had Miss Lydia Bennet come upon the town, or, as the happiest alternative, been secluded from the world in some distant farmhouse. And there, that phrase, come upon the town, is Jane Austen making a scandalous suggestion. And the reason we're being told the neighborhood is taking this philosophically is because, like most neighborhoods that are fueled by gossip, they want the worst. And the worst appears not to be going to happen here. But there was much to be talked of in marrying her, and the good-natured wishes of her well-being, which had proceeded before from all the spiteful old ladies of Meryton, lost but little of their spirit in this change of circumstances, because with such a husband her misery was considered certain. It was a fortnight since Mrs. Bennet had been downstairs, but on this happy day she again took her seat at the head of her table, and in spirits oppressively high. Oh. What's up, baby? What are you doing? Do you want to get down? Do you want to go over to your chair? Get down. I can watch you. I don't care about... Oh. Are you going to go over to your chair? Well, there you go. Now, are you going to make your bed, or are you just going to lay down? That's become a daily ritual, hasn't it? No sentiment of shame gave a damp to her triumph. The marriage of a daughter, which had been the first object of her wishes since Jane was 16, was now on the point of accomplishment, and her thoughts and her words ran wholly on those attendants of elegant nuptials, fine muslins, new carriages, and servants. Huge expenses. She was busily searching through the neighborhood for a proper situation for her daughter, and without knowing or considering what their income might be, rejected many as deficient in size or importance. She's shopping for homes for them. Hay Park might do, said she, if the Gouldings would quit it, or the great house at Stoke if the drawing-room were larger, but Ashworth is too far off. I could not bear to have her 10 miles from me, and as for Purvis Lodge, the attics are dreadful. Her husband allowed her to talk on without interruption while the servants remained. But when they had withdrawn, he said to her, Mrs. Bennet, before you take any or all of these houses for your son and daughter, let us come to a right understanding. Into one house in this neighborhood they shall never have admittance. I will not encourage the impudence of either by receiving them at Longbourn. So Mrs. Bennet is triumphing. She finally has a daughter getting married, and now her husband is saying she's not welcome at the house. A long dispute followed this declaration, but Mr. Bennet was firm. It soon led to another, and Mrs. Bennet found with amazement and horror that her husband would not advance a guinea to buy clothes for her daughter. He protested that she should receive from him no mark of affection whatever on the occasion. Mrs. Bennet could hardly comprehend it, that his anger could be carried to such a point of inconceivable resentment as to refuse his daughter a privilege without which her marriage would scarcely seem valid. Exceeded all that she could believe possible. She was more alive to the disgrace which the want of new clothes must reflect on her daughter's nuptials than any sense of shame at her eloping and living with Wickham a fortnight before they took place. I here agree with Mr. Bennet. You didn't care, so I don't care. You didn't think about the family doesn't think about you. I'll make arrangements for you to keep bread in your belly, but you're not welcome here. I'll never look at you again. Elizabeth was now most heartily sorry that she had, from the distress of a moment, been led to make Mr. Darcy acquainted with fears for her sister. For since her marriage would so shortly give the proper termination to the elopement, they might hope to conceal its unfavorable beginning from all those who were not immediately on the spot. Remember, she's already, in the moment that she learns about it, in distress, she confesses to Darcy what's going on, so he knows what's going on. She had no fear of its spreading further through his means. There were few people on whose secrecy she would have more confidently depended, but at the same time there was no one whose knowledge of her sister's frailty would have mortified her so much. Not, however, from any fear of disadvantage from it, individually, to herself, for at any rate there seemed a gulf impossible between them. Had Lydia's marriage been concluded on the most honourable terms, it was not to be supposed that Mr. Darcy would connect himself with a family where, to every other objection, would now be added an alliance and relationship of the nearest kind with the man he so justly scorned, Wickham. It wouldn't matter that if they had eloped or not. The husband in question is still the person he hates most in all the world. From such a connection she could not wonder that he should shrink. The wish of procuring her regard, which she had assured herself of his feeling in Derbyshire, could not in rational expectation survive such a blow as this. She was humbled, she was grieved, she repented, though she hardly knew of what. You are in love, you little moron. That's why you're so confused about all these feelings, because you love him. She became jealous of his esteem when she could no longer hope to be benefited by it. She wanted to hear of him when there seemed the least chance of gaining intelligence. She was convinced that she could have been happy with him when it was no longer likely they should meet. What a triumph for him, as soon as she thought, as she often thought, could he know that the proposals which she had proudly spurned only 4 months ago would now have been gladly and gratefully received. He was as generous, she doubted not, as most generous of his sex, but while he was mortal, there must be triumph. She began now to comprehend that he was exactly the man who, in disposition and talents, would most suit her. His understanding and temper, though unlike her own, would have answered all her wishes. It was an union that must have been to the advantage of both. By her ease and liveliness his mind might have been softened, his manners improved, and from his judgment, information, and knowledge of the world she must have received benefit of greater importance. But no such happy marriage could now teach the admiring multitude what connubial felicity really was. A union of different tendency and precluding the possibility of the other was soon to be formed in their family. It won't be them getting married, it'll be Wickham. How Wickham and Lydia were to be supported in tolerable independence she could not imagine. But how little of permanent happiness could belong to a couple who were only brought together because their passions were stronger than their virtue, she could easily conjecture. So, like everybody else in Meryton, she assumes they'll be miserable. Mr. Gardner soon wrote again to his brother. To Mr. Bennet's acknowledgment he briefly replied, with assurances of his eagerness to promote the welfare of any of his family, and concluded with entreaties that the subject might never be mentioned to him again. The principal purport of his letter was to inform them that Mr. Wickham had resolved on quitting the militia. So Mr. Gardner has two things he mainly wants to say. One is that Wickham is not going to stay in the militia, where he obviously doesn't belong. But the other, gotta love Mr. Gardner, is that he doesn't want to hear any more about how much Mr. Bennet owes him. They're all one family, in-law or not. They're all one family. He doesn't want to hear any more about it. It was greatly my wish that he should do so, he added, as soon as his marriage was fixed on, and I think you will agree with me in considering a removal from that corps as highly advisable, both on his account and my niece's. It is Mr. Wickham's intention to go into the regulars, and among his former friends there are still some who are able and willing to assist him in the army. He has the promise of an ensigncy in General Donohue's regiment, now quartered in the north, far away from London or Meryton. No doubt considered by Mr. Gardner to be another benefit to this whole arrangement. It is an advantage to have it so far from this part of the kingdom. He promises fairly, and I hope among different people, where they may each have a character to preserve, they will both be more prudent. I have written to Colonel Forster to inform him of our present arrangements and to request that he will satisfy the various creditors of Mr. Wickham in and near Brighton with assurances of speedy payment, for which I pledged myself. And will you give yourself the trouble of carrying similar assurances to his creditors in Meryton, of whom I shall subjoin a list, according to his information. He has given all his debts. I hope at least he has not deceived us. Haggerston has our directions, and all will be completed in a week. They will then join his regiment unless they are first invited to Longbourn, and I understand from Mrs. Gardner that my niece is very desirous of seeing you all before she leaves the South. She is well and begs to be dutifully remembered to you and her mother. Signed, Edward Gardner. Okay, so that's a useful letter. We learn a lot from it in a very little time. Wickham is intending to leave the regiment and join the regulars. He's going to join the army, a far more respectable and steady state of employment and income. And they'll be far removed from the source of their scandal. We give the scandal time to die down, and they'll be in a new territory where no one knows their past. So they can be respectable there. And there's the settlement of the debts. Mr. Gardner is telling Colonel Forster that between them they can settle his debts with his town creditors, and he wants Mr. Bennet to go around to all his creditors in Meryton and do the same. Pledge assurance that those debts will be paid. So a lot of effort is being put forward here on the part of two young people who don't deserve it, but that final note of the letter is that Lydia would like some note from her family. She hasn't had any note. Mr. Gardner has been corresponding with Mr. Bennet, but Mr. Bennet is so toweringly enraged that he doesn't send any personal notes to Lydia and has already told his wife that she's not welcome at her old home. He can settle money on her, but she can't talk on my doorstep again. Mr. Bennet and his daughters saw all the advantages of Wickham's removal from the neighborhood as clearly as Mr. Gardner could do, but Mrs. Bennet was not so well pleased with it. Lydia's being settled in the north just when she had expected most pleasure and pride in her company, for she had by no means given up her plan of their residing in Hertfordshire, was a severe disappointment. And besides, it was such a pity that Lydia should be taken from a regiment where she was acquainted with everybody and had so many favorites. She is so fond of Mrs. Forster, said she, and it will be quite shocking to send her away. And there are several of the young men, too, that she likes very much. The officers may not be so pleasant in General Donohue's regiment. Can you believe, after all this, one of the things that's bothering Mrs. Bennet is that Lydia's flirting opportunities might be lessened? The last thing you should be thinking about is how she likes to flirt with the officers of the militia. Incredible. His daughter's request, for such it must be considered, of being admitted into her family again. Important. The narrator reminds us it's not a trivial request, since Lydia is dumb, but she's not dumb enough not to know that her father would probably excommunicate her for this. Before she set off for the north, received at first an absolute negative. But Jane and Elizabeth, who agreed in wishing, for the sake of their sister's feeling and consequence, that she should be noticed on her marriage by her parents, urged him so earnestly, yet so rationally and so mildly, to receive her and her husband at Longbourn as soon as they were married, that he was prevailed on to think as they thought, and act as they wished. To take Wickham under your own roof. They must have been very good. I wish I could have got a scene like that. They must have been very good. And their mother had the satisfaction of knowing that she should be able to show her married daughter in the neighborhood before she was banished to the north. When Mr. Bennet wrote again to his brother, therefore, he sent his permission for them to come, and it was settled that as soon as the ceremony was over, they should proceed to Longbourn. Elizabeth was surprised, however, that Wickham should consent to such a scheme, and she had consulted only with her own inclination. Any meeting with him would have been the last object of her wishes, because if they come to Longbourn, she's going to meet with him. And Mr. Bennet agrees, for respectability's sake, if nothing else, to have them come to the house where he can see them once they're married. So that is the chapter. We get a lot of information packed into a relatively small chapter. I would love to have seen the original reactions to Mr. Gardner's letter. I would also love to have seen a couple of those scenes where Jane and Elizabeth tried to talk Mr. Bennet around to seeing his daughter's face again. It's a thing that I always say about Pride and Prejudice. Pride and Prejudice, of course, has spawned over the last century innumerable pastiches, innumerable of them. What happens to everybody after the events of Pride and Prejudice? What happens to everybody before the events of Pride and Prejudice? What happens to side characters during Pride and Prejudice, like, for instance, Joe Baker's Longbourn? But one book that I would love to see at 900 pages would be someone writing Pride and Prejudice. It'd be effrontery. It would have to be fan fiction. It couldn't be. You couldn't get it published. Fans would revolt. Except that I think plenty of fans are probably just as curious as I am. A 900-page version of this book, written in Jane Austen's voice, that shows us all the scenes that we're not getting, would be heaven to me. I think in a way it would be heaven. But we're not going to get that. Instead, we're going to get Jane Austen doing what she does. So we will move on to the next chapter and see what happens next. So I will wrap this up for now. I will see you all then. Thank you, BookTube.